Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by Congressional reporter Kate Scanlon. Kate, we had another round of January 6th committee hearings. This week there was a sort of a bombshell dropped. Now there may be some walking of it back, but there was a surprise hearing, a surprise witness. Talk a little bit about what she had to say.
Yeah, so the committee had previously indicated that it was going to push its additional hearings into July after the recess, but
Right.
Surprised everyone this week with an additional hearing with the witness, Cassidy Hutchinson, who was an aide to former Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, who spoke a little bit about what was going on in the White House in the days leading up to the riot at the Capitol. And there were a number of bombshells in that testimony. Some of them are there's been some pushback from some people in the orbit, but it was definitely an interesting hearing this week.
So, I mean, the committee has made an effort to try to link the riot that happened at the Capitol with the efforts by some in the former President Donald Trump's legal team and some of his outside political associates, maybe even some people working at the White House to try to challenge the Electoral College results in a somewhat constitutionally unorthodox way, shall we say. And Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony, I think, was clearly an effort to sort of do that, where she, by making accusations about Trump's awareness of people in the crowd being armed, of maybe being a little more insistent about possibly going to the Capitol than we'd previously heard, that is an attempt at linking it. So to talk a little bit about what she had to say specifically about what she saw.
It is. Some of the more, I think, shocking revelations that she shared with the committee were, she had said that after a conversation with Rudy Giuliani in early January, she went to her boss, Mark Meadows, and said she was scared about what could happen on January 6th.
Right.
And he had replied to her, things could get real, real bad. And so that was one thing she had said during her testimony. Another thing was, as you mentioned, on the day of the rally prior to the riot, there were security magnometers that the crowd was supposed to go through to be at a certain place for the rally.
Right.
And she had said that the president seemed to want those magnometers removed because some people in the crowd had weapons, and he wanted the crowd to look bigger on television. That's something the former president pushed back on his social media website.
Right.
But that was one of the pieces of testimony. And then there was another piece of testimony about just how much effort the former president went to try and go to the Capitol that day, as staff and Secret Service would not allow him to do so.
So, I mean, we saw some Secret Service pushback against the idea that there was a physical altercation between the former president and his protective detail, that Trump was trying to grab the wheel and drive over to the Capitol himself, that maybe they got into a little bit of fisticuffs over that. Talk a little bit about the fact that there really is nobody on the committee. There are two Republicans on the committee, but they're committed to basically the same narrative about what happened on January 6th as the Democrats on the committee. Talk about the fact that there really isn't anybody on the committee who cross-examines witnesses in a hostile way or does anything at all adversarial, that all of these things are kind of after the fact, after the hearing.
So this is a growing source of frustration, it seems, for the former president, that nobody's there to defend him in these hearings. There was, when this committee was being created, Kevin McCarthy had made a number of appointments to it, some of which were rejected by Speaker Pelosi, Jim Jordan, Jim Banks, who she said were witnesses in the committee's investigation. And so in retaliation for that, Minority Leader McCarthy pulled his nominations, and so it was actually Nancy Pelosi who nominated Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger to this panel. And so because there's no one who's an avid supporter of the former president, he feels that
or advocating for him in any way.
Right. He feels that his side is not being told in these hearings, and there's no one to kind of push back or question the witnesses or in an adversarial way. So what we were just discussing, that piece of testimony from Cassidy Hutchinson, when she shared that, there's a couple of really interesting points about that. She was sharing a story that she heard secondhand, and she said she heard it secondhand.
Right, she testified to that.
Yes,
Yep.
And then there's been some Secret Service pushback, but that pushback has not been under oath yet, at least yet, and she was. So these are all interesting things to navigate for the committee, and it is a sticky situation they've ended up with for themselves, especially given this hearing was a surprise as well.
So as if the January 6 hearings weren't enough, obviously the Supreme Court has overturned Roe versus Wade, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization decision, sending the issue back to the states. But Democrats would really like to keep it a national issue, both in terms of the campaign, but also legislatively. So there's been talk about bringing up an abortion bill that would codify Roe versus Wade, so-called, that's how they're describing it. A particularly expansive version of this legislation already failed after the decision leaked. What is the status of this now?
About the same. They don't have the math to pass it. There are discussions this week. The president suggested that maybe there should be an exception to the filibuster to get this legislation through. But the thing about that legislation is Joe Manchin wasn't on board for that.
Right.
So even if they did a filibuster carve out for it, unless he's changed his position on it in light of recent events, they still don't have the math to pass it, even without the filibuster.
And the two pro-choice Republicans in the Senate, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, didn't vote for it. So it actually was rejected by a majority of the Senate, wouldn't have advanced even if there was no filibuster.
Exactly.
Suppose in theory, though, this would require Manchin and Sinema to take a different position on the filibuster than they did during voting rights. But in theory, if they could come up with a more modest bill, one that didn't really go much further than Roe and Casey, get Collins and Murkowski and maybe Manchin to vote for it, maybe you could do something?
Maybe if they were willing to change their position on the filibuster.
Right.
But the thing about Joe Manchin's opposition to this bill in the past was that it did go beyond Roe. He was comfortable with the standards set by Roe. He wasn't comfortable with going beyond it. And this bill went pretty far beyond it.
Right.
So
superseding all state level abortion restrictions.
Exactly. So if they were willing to do a more modest bill, maybe there'd be some minds changed, but this week spokespersons for both Manchin and Sinema have reiterated that they remain in support of the filibuster.
And House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, it seems that she wants another vote on the bill that failed in May.
She does, and that's interesting because the House has already passed this bill. So she could do that again, she could keep doing it, but the Senate math doesn't change.
Well, it's Pelosi's right to choose what happens in the House. Thank you, Kate. You can read Kate and the rest of our political team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.